Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are joining you from these United States of America here in the middle of the country at the confluence of two rivers, the Raccoon, the Des Moines River. We are The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr here on Iowa Catholic Radio, joining you today. Bud, tell people what you do at Mercy College of Health Sciences right here in Des Moines, Iowa.
I'm the Associate Provost at Mercy College of Health Sciences. We do have a full-fledged provost now at the college, so I'm truly an associate again.
Bud is shining. His face is very happy, right?
That's right. And, you know, you mentioned the Raccoon River. I'm amazed at raccoons. Like, I'll never have a river named after me, but raccoons were enough of a presence that, like, the pioneers or whoever, the Jesuits, whoever was walking through Iowa was like, like historic Iowa was like, we're going to call this one the Raccoon River. I wonder what the raccoons were up to where they're like, we got to name this river after them. My
children just think that there were dead raccoons in the river. I don't know where they got that one, but that's what they say.
It gets bleak fast in the Bonner household.
That's right. Well, Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives over at Mercy College of Health Sciences, the Director of the Center for Human Flourishing. The Des Moines River, that's a big one where I thought in French Des Moines means the monks, but evidently there's a counter narrative that it's a like Moine can be a short version of a word in France. So
burritos, right? The Burritos River? No, I don't know. I'm just making things up.
I was like, this is getting weird fast. But the commonality, of course, between both of us here at Mercy College, Mercy College that underwrites our show. Thank you, Mercy College, mchs.edu. We have gotten done with the spring semester. We are gearing up for the summer semester. That's right. If you, depending on what program you get into, you can be getting that degree all year long so that you can get into the workforce very quickly, mchs.edu.
It's been a fun few weeks at the college. Like in April, we did the inauguration of our fourth president, Dr. Adrian Henry, was on the bishop's show this week. And that was a big celebration. But then just a couple weeks later, we transitioned into commencement. I don't want to get weepy on air, but, that's, of course, one of my favorite events of the year. And I think what's really cool, Bo, is like at our commencement, just the exuberant joy that you'll hear from some families. And, for me, it teaches me not to take for granted how education can transform life. So I do feel blessed to be working at Mercy College of Health Sciences here in the heart of Des Moines, preparing healthcare professionals to continue the healing ministry of Jesus Christ.
No, I think that's exactly right. And the exuberant joy I feel always taking off the big black robe after being in lights up on the stage is always. I always feel bad for anybody who has to be in smelling distance. But fantastic, Dr. Henry. If anyone is, I hope you listened to his interview. But if you've met the guy. He's pretty exuberant, and so I have to say that might have been the most pumped up a crowd of students has been. He did a great job hyping them up before declaring them graduated. It was pretty cool.
But not feeling exuberant about something. This time of year, we normally make fun of the Chicago Cubs. That was not a smooth transition, but it's on my mind. Normally as the weather starts to get warmer and the trees start to bloom, we're making fun of the Cubs. We're celebrating the Cardinals' success. It's been a rough go so far. So I was reading this week that the last time the Cardinals finished in last place in the division was like 1981. It was like Whitey Herzog's last year as a manager. But before that, the previous last time before 1981 was like 1917. It was like World War I or something. So we're very spoiled as Cardinals fans. During my lifetime, we've only finished in last place once. But I guess in 2023, I get some sense of what it's like to be a Cubs fan every day of the year.
I will say, if I'm not mistaken, whatever year the Cards were in last place, the next year they won the World Series.
There you go.
So we'll see. To. Yeah. Also, it's really early, and the last time we won the World Series, what was 2011, right?
Sounds right.
And we were horrible and backed into the playoffs, and then went on a run. So maybe we're just setting it up to be dramatic, sort of like this show. We've set up the show to be dramatic. We're going to talk about ethics. We're going to talk about the way things work word-wise. We're probably going to bring up controversial subjects. It's going to be a home run Hall of Fame season of a show. You don't want to miss it. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. We're back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. It is always wonderful to have you with us, whether that be listening live on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network throughout the state of Iowa on iowacatholicradio.com, where you can listen live. Of course, you can listen live on the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or you good folks joining us through podcast. Again, love to have you with us listening to the show. So, Bud, today, I don't know if it's, I never know if, I always go, oh, maybe this is nebulous. It can go all sorts of places. But then I also we talk about variants of this a lot. I think a lot of the problems, Bud, that we run into when we're talking about theology, the church, how that interacts with the world, has to do with the slipperiness of language, the way that language can sort of creep and change, and we can, the sort of easy example that we always give is when people go, the word literally seems to mean figuratively now, because of the kids and stuff like this. One of the things that makes this sort of work, and I think we can unpack today, is even if terms change, so if there's realities, of course, that we believe don't change, nothing's new under the sun, these really are sort of stable. The word and definitions that we use, of course, change because obviously languages change. English hasn't existed, for instance, since the beginning of time. And so even words that have been well established change and grow because of context. What brought this up today is this past week, I was driving the kids to school, and my son started talking about, he's great at bringing up stuff like this. He was like, should we really call every time that that there's a wreck, should we call it a car accident every time? Because he's like, accident seems to imply that it wasn't intentional or that it was a mistake that everybody's like, hey, no big deal. But he's like, of course there's times where, sometimes people intend to wreck their cars or they're drunk drivers or things like this. So he was like, why do we sort of just call all things car accidents, even though that's not seemingly what they are? And so we talked about the logical definition of words or the ethical definition, right? Like logical, you kind of get at the heart of the meaning. Ethical seems to make a judgment about whether it was proper or not. And then I threw out that, there's also sort of the conventional way that we talk. So it was a really great point because, when you say car accident, I'm usually not thinking about the intent of any of the drivers. I'm just like, oh, something happened where cars stopped doing what they're supposed to do, driving around, and we call those all car accidents. But to me, what this really brings up is something very much in the news that a lot of pro-life Catholic advocates are having to deal with, which is the conventional word abortion almost always means very technically procured, direct, intended abortions, right? So the idea is an abortion is I go and get one, I pay for it, I have the procedure done because I'm trying to end the life of the fetal human in a womb. But the problem, of course, is in a very technical sense, abortion is a very wide term. So, for instance, all miscarriages, spontaneous abortion is the sort of technical name in the medical field. So people, I think, are pulling a maneuver where they're like, oh, well, Catholics and pro-life people, they're against abortion. So what does that mean? Are you going to outlaw miscarriages? And you go, well, no. A conventional term, abortion, is used for a very specific technical term, intentional direct abortion, and you're equivocating it with another technical term, which is spontaneous abortion, another word that is colloquially called miscarriage. But I actually think, so that's an ethical example, and that's sort of a lot of in the wheelhouse of my training and, when I teach. But I actually think that this pervades a lot of the confusions that any time we're talking about religion or religious truth or moral truth that we get into, is there's obviously terms that don't change, but our words are obviously going to change and slip throughout time as sort of things, just process in the natural way in which humans talk to each other. I think that this is at the heart of a lot of confusion that theologians should, and moral philosophers should take as their task to help people clarify.
Yeah, Bo, I think this is something that our culture is actually onto a little bit. So we talk about cancel culture and this idea that something that you say on social media can effectively end your career or something. And instinctively, we feel, we have this impulse like that's wrong-headed. You know, like growing up, authorities will tell you, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And so there's this kind of base assumption in human culture, like, well, words aren't that big of a deal. Like, if someone, insults you, let it roll off your back. But in recent years, we've actually come to a point where we realize words are really important, and the way we name things, like you're talking about with like pro-life questions. You and I both had the privilege of studying under Stanley Hauerwas, who's probably the greatest living moral theologian or ethicist. And he said something, I'm probably going to butcher the quote, so Stanley, if you're listening, I apologize. But he told us in class that you cannot learn to live rightly until you see the world rightly, and you cannot see the world rightly unless you speak truthfully or name things accurately. An extreme example that he gave us, but one that's always stuck with me, he said, say there's a prisoner in a concentration camp, and a prison guard says to the prisoner, like, unless you sleep with me, unless you commit adultery, I'm going to keep you in this prison, or I'm going to murder you, And so the woman who's in prison, she faces this choice: do I commit adultery, or possibly free myself and my child from this concentration camp? And Stanley would say to us, like, there's this impulse again to say, like, well, what she does in that case, if she sleeps with the prison guard, is not adultery. He says, no, like, we have to continue to name that as a sin, because to do otherwise would be to obscure or occlude the tragedy of this situation, that sometimes human beings are put in situations where, in some sense, there's not a simple good choice. So we continue to name that as sin, and then as we branch outwards and we look at like more of the normal situations or day-to-day situations that we face in our lives, we see this with so many moral issues. And without like sort of drawing a conclusion with any of them, like we can think about, like something like abortion. Is it a fetus or an unborn child? Do we say that a pregnancy was terminated or something different happened? And I know many of most of our listeners, I hope, are pro-life. It's a great concern of the church and of Catholics here in central Iowa. But we can, I think we can be challenged with this thing as well. So we think about those who maybe are trying to cross borders in the world. Do we say that they're illegal aliens, illegals, or that they're migrants, or perhaps oftentimes our brothers and sisters in Christ? Is this particular conflict a just war? Or is it, do we just allow sort of like exaggerated patriotic language to prevent us from ever getting to like a close moral evaluation of what's taking place? And so the way we name things and the way we talk, it's not sort of like, it's not this like side concern of Christian thought. It's really front and center of good theology. Yeah,
and to go back to the example from Stanley Hauerwas about the person in duress, right, in the concentration camp, being pressured to do the wrong thing. His point, because I know exactly what you're saying, I just want to make very clear to people, what neither Bud nor Stanley is saying is that woman is culpable for what happens. And this is something where I think in other Christian denominations maybe, will hear Catholics make a distinction between naming the act objectively and then the culpability as like this big sort of Jesuitical way to get out of like saying it was someone's fault. And you go, no, the reason that we have to have something like the objective declaration of the act and then the culpability is, to your point, we don't want to start to say, well, something's not really something else. It's not really murder, it's not really lying, it's not really blank. Because to do that, and to your point, Stanley's point, is to round off the edges of us trying to speak truthfully, to your point, that makes us get in the habit of always trying to do that. In the situation you're speaking of, we want to say, objectively, adultery is wrong. Christ says it. We have natural laws, reasons to say that it shouldn't be done. But in this situation, this person has been put in dire duress where it is a tragedy, whatever's chosen. Yeah. Because even if this person doesn't commit the adultery, the tragedy is they're stuck in a concentration camp and probably have signed their own death warrant. And so what Stanley's trying to point out is also speaking accurately is to name things as tragic in this life because, like we say when we make the distinction between mortal venial sin but also culpability in general, there are certain things that they are just what they are. But in this life, we know that that person under that duress, what else, they don't have full knowledge, because what else are they supposed to do? And to be able to be honest and precise about that is part of this, and I think this is Lindbeck. This is another one Stanley brings up, is theology is taking care of words, not being careful like in an HR, PR sense, but actually taking care of the words that we've been entrusted to speak as a religion of the word.
Yeah, I probably shouldn't have left that one as open-ended as I did. Like the actual purpose of the example is, of course, not to condemn the woman in any way, regardless of what choice she makes, but to, like you said, acknowledge the tragic nature of the situation. And so that sort of moral reasoning, like there's a way where you could talk about that example in a class and people would think like, oh, so part of the purpose of morality is to start to see ins and outs. The exact opposite is the case. You're acknowledging the tragedy of the situation. You're acknowledging that the woman's culpability is severely mitigated because of the options in front of her. But by continuing to name it objectively as sin, it gives us it keeps us in the framework of actually facing the moral situations that we're most likely to face in life.
And I mean, this happens a lot why we want to bring up the context of things and it not simply be, as you're pointing out, trying to get out of something.
Yeah.
And this is difficult because in our own situations, when we do anything, we have a lot of vested interest to sort of create outs for ourselves.
Yeah.
The hope of something like confession and an examination of conscience is for us to say internally, to go, well, I mean, I don't know, what was my intention then? It's not like you can automatically determine all intentionality. You should be able to determine some. I mean, that gets into like more like very technical ethical philosophy to bring up. But this is the question you have to ask yourself. Only you, in some ways, like praying with God and asking, know were you trying to get, hit an escape button or not. But what we're trying to say is, in a world where language itself grows, because that's the way we become ever more capable of understanding each other, that we have to be careful when we consider the way that we talk about things. So to go back to the car accident example, what I'm not trying to say is, so never call it a car accident, bud, unless you know it was accidental. No, it's fine to say colloquially, conventionally, that's what we say. But if, for instance, you go before court, or if you yourself, have like a car accident, like we're calling it that, but you meant to hit someone, you can't go like, well, it's a car accident, right? So since it's an accident, I'm not at fault. If you try to sneak around with conventional word definitions, that's what I'm getting at. So that's why I think the abortion one is important. If you're using a conventional way to talk to get out of moral jams to the detriment of others, I think that that's the problem. I only bring up in sometimes that the conventional word is, in fact, problematic enough that we should say, maybe we should reconsider the word that we use. And for me, and I know not everyone agrees with me on this, I think we're hitting an inflection point where maybe we need to be much more specific about the word we use, because abortion is now being sort of widely cast. And there's even laws that I have to admit that are, in essence, pro-life laws, but they're too broad. So like it is worrisome about the way in which they go against what Catholic teaching has already said. If you have a miscarriage and medically you have the unborn baby that's no longer alive, right? So the fetus is not coming down. There's all sorts of medical procedures that Catholic social teaching and bioethics says, of course, you can remove that so that the mother's health is fine. There are some, can be attended to, I should say. There are some laws that I think make it not clear because of exactly what we're talking about, where the conventional word is used and it bleeds over into the technical language.
Yeah, it's too bad. Certainly in conversations like, at work and with colleagues who maybe aren't Catholic, like this confusion is evident to me sometimes. But even in sort of like intra-Catholic discussions, I feel like, I don't know, maybe I'm overstating the case, but like the church's long history of reasoning about these cases is not well known. So like there's something that we talk about in our bioethics course here at Mercy College of Health Sciences, the principle of double effect, where again, a sort of like easy example or well-known example is, say there is a pregnancy where the life of the mother is in danger, maybe like an ectopic pregnancy, and there's an intervention where the physicians, the attending physicians know that the life of the child will be lost or likely lost, but the intention is not, of course, to end the life of the child, but to save the life of the mother. And in all of those cases, like Catholic hospitals, they have ethics boards who look at it and apply the principle of double effect and say, like the intention here is completely different than what we would say with like a procured abortion, merely chosen for like convenience or something like that, But that sort of thing is not well known. Now, Bo, like one thing that I struggle with, like, so we're talking about this now, and a lot of times, like, most of my close friends are Catholic, and we can sort of like gain traction with this sort of conversation. It feels like public discourse in our country, like the train is so far down the tracks, and it's hard to know like how to enter strategically into public discourse because the language has been so, and I don't want to sound Manichaean, but like so corrupted, or like it's just like the basic assumptions are so far afield from like Catholic principles that it feels difficult to try to like redeem it.
Yeah, and I would argue that one of the chief ways in which language becomes conventional. So what do we mean by conventional? So, I mean, on one hand, convention is just to say it's like idiomatic, meaning that you would only, it's the words don't literally match to what they're trying to say, but if you live in the context, you understand it. So a very silly example is saying what's up. What's up has nothing to do in English in America with what it's actually saying. To say what's up is to say, what have you been up to? How are you doing? Like this whole field of things. So that's a convention, right? But of course, politics is the greatest conventional language and the one that causes the most damage. Politically, at least how it's sort of been reduced in the American public context, is we have all sorts of words that are almost conventional totems, right? That if you bring them up, what you're really doing is signaling which side of big divides that you are on. And so precisely when we get into talk about abortion as elective procured abortion versus spontaneous abortion, which is, like we said, conventionally called miscarriage, this is now, so to speak, been sucked into the black hole of conventional political discourse. And so the reason it's so far away, but on one hand, it's like you said, the people who are pro-choice, as conventionally understood, have a definition that you said is very far away from the consideration of what Catholics say. It's true. But I actually would say that in some ways, the bigger part is how pro-life positions are like, and maybe that's not even right, the Catholic position, because it succumbs to conventional political ways to speak about it. It's not only that we can't get into the nuance of it, because it's an issue about making sure you're on the right side of a debate, we're not even talking about it. We're talking about what side of it that it represents it's on. And to me, that is why we are so far afield from being able to be precise and actually let people who aren't Catholic know the fullness of the Catholic view, because it automatically gets put into the meat grinder of conventional political discourse.
Yeah, something we can get into more in the second half of the show, but as you're talking, a struggle for me, and like today's show is kind of tough to navigate, to be honest, because we are kind of like branching into issues that even among Catholics can sometimes be like explosive or controversial. But I do think there's a certain level of discernment that needs to take place, like in local Catholic communities. And what I have in mind is, so there can sometimes be kind of a reactionary position because of a concern about like a lack of purity of the position. And the specific conversation I have in mind, again, we'll probably have to address this in the second half of the show, is so like a couple summers ago with the question of Black Lives Matter. And I know Catholics sometimes heard or saw that movement taking place, and they thought like, well, I see elements of it that seem so inimical to what I believe that I don't want anything to do with it. And I feel like we talk about like entering into public discourse and being prophetic and speaking the truth, like from my vantage point, and this is a prudential judgment, that movement, regardless of maybe its rougher edges, it brought up questions that Catholics had important things to speak to. Mm-hmm. And so with our Lord's admonition to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves, I think sometimes, unfortunately, Catholic communities do sort of miss an opportunity to enter into those situations. I know we're close to the break, so we can jump into that sort of question in the second half of the show, but that's what was kind of coming to mind as you were speaking.
No, I think that that's a great place to start with the sort of contemporary thing, and then I think we can go all the way back to actually some of the beginning councils to talk about how this all actually has theological bearing. It's not just in our ethical language here in the church as well. So this is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. I don't know if we're being maybe we're being feisty, right? Bringing up feisty topics. But this is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show, all the ways that it's available to do so. Listening live on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network here in Iowa, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, iowacatholicradio.com, and then, of course, if you're listening on podcast, thank you for listening to the show. Bud, we're talking about the slipperiness of words, and that if we are a religion of the word, right, the word become flesh, it's our responsibility to take care of words, not be careful with words like don't get in trouble, but that we have, in some ways, to be responsible towards words themselves is a sort of reflection of having that sort of relationship with Jesus, the Word himself. So we've been talking about, especially ethically so far, I think we can get into theology of it as well, where the term, right, so there's things that don't change, but then the words we use do change, obviously, because we speak English but instead of Latin, or Old English, or, with your ancestors, think Norwegian, something like that. So obviously, we have to take care through time to speak well, and that's always going to be a responsibility because words change even if terms don't. We brought up abortion and how this is sort of a key moment in our political discourse about the difference between a conventional meaning of that word versus more technical ones, ethical ones, logical ones. And then you ended the segment talking about how a few summers ago with Black Lives Matter, people got obsessed, I think, weirdly enough, not immediately, in the days following sort of George Floyd in the protests and things like this, I thought for a moment people were really trying to just talk about the issues and how different communities come to it, quickly interlacing with all sorts of other political things. To your point, to speak to what was being brought up had to be, it seemed, in the sort of conventional public way, tied with other political concerns that made it where things that Catholics both had to say about race, maybe things that we needed to take deep looks at and confess, but also resources that our theology could bring to the table seemingly got lost precisely because we let the sort of conventional political language take over rather than trying to speak to the logical sense of these words, the ethical import, and also with honesty about what Catholic social teaching and theology had to speak about a situation on the ground. I mean, we recorded some episodes that I thought in that sort of immediate halo tried to get at that and get people to see it different. I think some people respected and enjoyed it. We didn't catch a lot of flack for it, but maybe that's because no one listens. Who knows? But I think that's what we were getting at. You were getting at with your comment at the end of the last segment.
Well, and at the end of that segment, too, you gestured towards church history, and I think this is a great way to dive deeper into what we're talking about. And Bo, I think this conversation, it also shows why the church has always dedicated resources to giving certain individuals the time to think and to write, because language guarding or language care takes time, and it takes a certain level of intellectual aptitude. That doesn't mean every member of the body of Christ is called to it, but we have seen that the church has always said, look, we know to dive deep into church history that we have to actually enable people to do that, to have the time set aside to do that. But we can jump back to, so you mentioned the church councils, and in the early church there arose a movement called Arianism, where Arius was an ordained priest, as far as we know from his life, a faithful priest in the fact that he cared for his people and served them and seemingly wanted to serve the good of the church. But he came to the conclusion in his desire to guard the oneness of God, where he said the Son of God is the greatest of all God's creatures, but there was a time when the Son was not. So he thought that to ascribe divinity to the second person of the Trinity would call into question the oneness of God. He's trying to make sense of what the New Testament says about who God is and his essence, and then, who Christ is and his purpose and the plan of salvation. Well, the church, there was some serious arguments about this, and if you took a time machine back to when Arius was walking the earth, the debates might have been disorienting. But as they went on, Arius and his followers, it's interesting, they were willing to sign on to any passage of Scripture. So sometimes these Scripture passages were quoting we believe the Bible all the way down, or the canon. And sometimes, they too would also flip passages of Scripture. They'd say, look, Jesus at one point says, why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. How do we make sense of this passage? Eventually the church decided that to close the question and to speak truthfully about what it believed about Jesus Christ, we had to say that the Son of God was homoousios in Greek, or consubstantial with the Father. It's difficult to find a perfect translation, but of the same substance. And we confess this in the Creed each Sunday at Mass. And so you see there that in this instance, Bo, we're getting at, there was the language of Scripture, and the church said, what God has revealed in his written word, this tells us the truth of who Jesus Christ is. But to actually, in the movement of history, to confront the dangers of what Arius was bringing to the surface, the church had to kind of use a new term, or to use language that was in the water at the time, but to use it in that precise manner.
No, I think that's precisely where I was going to go. I'm glad that we have ESP on this one, because I'm not going to say the whole combat of this time in church history came down to one word, but it's really indicative of all of the fights that were happening then, bud. And what's interesting about that word is if you go back in history, even 100 years before the Council of Nicaea, that word didn't even mean that, right? It was a sort of contentious word in Greek language, in Greek philosophy, but it sort of served the occasion to get at the term that had to be true for theology to mean what it meant, even if it meant taking a word from the pagan context and sort of refashioning it. And that refashioning, I have to say, didn't really stop, except, I don't know, what would you say about at least the next 2 to 3 councils really sort of hammering out, this is the word we're saying, this is what it means, this is what it points to, and this is the term that has always been in the deposit of faith, but has waited for this time, so the 300s, to be explicated, right? It's time that this seed that had been planted in the Scriptures with Christ's words himself in his reality bloom. But that blooming bud had to take place with words that, so to speak, wore the reality of the context that it's in. It is a very Greek word. It has Greek philosophy all through it. But we have an incarnational religion, right? So God himself intended, I would say, for that time to be the ready place for that word to be used and reshaped in order to make something that has always been the case obvious. Yeah. And so to get to, the big Newman point that we're butting up against, that's what development of doctrine has to mean. It can't mean we decided that what we said was wrong, and we're just adapting to the times. What we're saying is we have an incarnational religion that has eternal truths that God has waited in time for the right moment. Now is an acceptable time, to use the context of a certain language, a certain civilization, to make explicit what has always been implicit.
Yeah, this also ties into another example to kind of wrap your mind around this is Eucharistic theology. So from the beginning, Christ, during his earthly ministry, said, I am the bread of life. You must eat my flesh and drink my blood. Whoever does not eat my flesh does not have life in him. At the Last Supper, he blesses bread, breaks it, gives it to his disciples, says, this is my body broken for you, right? And so the church has always believed that. At a certain point in history, these controversies about what exactly that meant, is Christ's body localized on the altar? What is that? How does it relate to his body in heaven? Are we gnawing on the flesh of Christ in some sense when we receive Holy Communion? And so these controversies were kicked up. And during the Middle Ages, under the influence of great theologians like Thomas Aquinas, there was specific language that was utilized to guard the truth of the faith. So famously, transubstantiation, crib notes. So at Mass, we say that the accidents of bread and wine remain the same, its characteristics, but the substance or the essence of them, are transformed into the body and blood of Christ. In recent years, it's interesting, like when you get around the theology nerds, you have to teach this to undergraduates. We all know that in modern science, like the word substance seemingly, or it's used to mean different things than what, like the way that St. Thomas Aquinas was using it. So
right.
You'll find theologians who say, well, Thomas was operating under the influence of Aristotelian categories. He was reading Aristotle. He said accidents and substance. Those things mean something different today. So they think we kind of have to chuck out this language. But it's sort of my position, and I think the church is like, there hasn't been a better conceptual term developed for what takes place at the altar than transubstantiation. We can wrestle with it. We can continue to reflect on it. I think church authorities would even say, like, if a better sort of conceptual tool was developed, like, we would be open to that. But most of the times when theologians have tried to mess with that language, they actually, I think, move away from what the church affirms about the Eucharist.
I like that. Okay, so this is good because accidents connects us back to my son's point about car accidents. Yeah. Accidents gets confusing in English because we think accident has a lot to do with intention rather than what it did in scholastic philosophy, which meant something that could change and not change the thing that changed. So Bud and I, if you guys happen to see us now versus when we started the radio show, Bud has gray hair, I have white hair in my beard, but we're still Bud and Bo. Those are accidents according, right, scholastically. So, okay, Bud, maybe in English you could debate whether we should use a different word. Technically fine, it's just what word even gets close. We still, I think what we're arguing is it's at this point still more clear to teach scholastic philosophy to catch people up rather than come up with a different word which would confuse things. The one that I think is truly an example of what we're getting at about like words creeping and getting different meanings, but we're kind of in a stuck in a place, is substance. Because substance, right, think about the word, where do most people, Catholics included, hear the word substance other than this debate? Substance abuse. Yeah. And substance, and that means like, just something you can, like, so substance almost actually now means accident in the scholastic sense, just like literally means figure. It's almost a complete switch. But I'm with you. What would you throw out as a different word than substance? Precisely because substance is one of the few, not the few, but, English mostly comes from a sort of Germanic heritage with its words, but it has a huge subset of Latinate ones. Substance is obviously one, substantia. And so then you go, I don't know, Bud, maybe what we should do is make a distinction between the English word substance and get Catholics to start saying substantia, which is another interesting thing when people go, why do you use the high-minded language in Mass? Right? Remember when the new English Mass translation came out? Why don't you put it in words people know? And you go, in some ways, sometimes, the way to maintain the most clarity is to use an anachronistic word so that it doesn't go through the cycle of changes. And I think that might be one of them. But what this gets back to is to bring up the Black Lives Matter debates that we were talking about. What I'm sad about continually, and I think I hear this from some of the folks, that, for instance, that we were, the black folks that were willing to come and talk to us on the show, is because we allow the sort of conventional political language to let things spin out of control, we don't get to say something that I think is absolutely true, which is racism is not just bad or wrong or rude, it's a heresy. It's grounded in modernism, like polygenesis, right? That like the various peoples of the world don't have a common ancestor in Adam and Eve, and that somehow race, a word and a concept developed late in human history, in fact at the dawn of modernity, is heretical. It is a wrong, disproven, against the teaching of the church concept of humans. And wherever it still has remnant control over things, which I think, so you don't have to be like, well, I'm not racist because I don't buy into an ideology of racism or something like this. Fine, but if something's a heresy, even if you don't believe in the heresy itself, but you sort of help along something that is informed priorly by the heresy, as Catholics, but that takes on a completely different dimension. Yeah. And I think that that's what didn't get to be spoken about, because we allowed a very important conversation to very quickly spin out of control into conventional political terminology rather than trying to ground it in the word care of Catholic theology.
Well, I'm going to take a little bunny trail here, and if it's the wrong direction, you just tackle me here in the studio, Bo. But I think this is a perfect foray into like a deeper conversation too about evangelism and discipleship. So our Lord, like one of the passages in the New Testament that I've really wrestled with is when Christ says, I speak in parables so that people won't understand in turn, and we don't have time to get into the Old Testament background of that passage today. But Christ also at another point says, anyone who picks up an important task always counts the cost. So before you build a tower, unless you're living in Pittsburgh, you count the cost first. Like a general before he fights a battle will count the cost. And so Christ himself, he's upfront with his listeners that the path of discipleship is costly, that it will require taking up your cross daily. And we think about language care. Sometimes I hear people say, like, maybe as Catholics, like, we talk about indulgences and reparation and the Immaculate Conception, and this language in the world, it's just foreign to people. But I think we have to be careful about, like, dropping that language or trying to too easily translate it. Well, like, God in heaven loves you, and just, like, reducing the gospel to that. Because I think the greatness of our faith is that it calls people into something that costs a great deal. And, like, this is even related to RCIA in its best form. It's supposed to be going back to the early church where someone is inspired by what the apostles or other Christians are teaching about Christ. They want to follow this way, and the church has the wherewithal to say to them, like, look, this is not something that you can pick up in a day. It's going to require a year or more's time of preparation and sacrifice and learning a new language. St. John Henry Newman has a beautiful homily about this, learning the new language of Christ. And he says, most of us want to be changed. We just want to be half-made. We don't want to go through the purgative process that's involved in being completely transformed. And even with the language that we speak, like, it's a good thing. We call people into this way of life where it's sort of like it requires learning an entirely new language.
I think, I'm glad you actually went this direction, because I think this gets to the heart of the matter. When we consider in the world but not of the world, I think a lot of it has to do linguistically. So in the world, right, Paul says, to the Jew be a Jew, to the Greek be the Greek. Don't let your person be the reason someone doesn't come to Christ. And so he's willing to be very context-specific with the homilies he gives. We see this evidenced in Acts, like compared to Paul at in Athens versus when he's speaking in synagogues. But to your next point, Paul also writes extensive letters where he goes, what you thought was the case is no longer so. Yeah. And I do think, Bud, that one of the main ways maybe the contemporary church fails at this mission is we've crossed those wires. So there's some of us who, we want to hold on to the integrity of the faith and the fact that no matter how much development of doctrine occurs, it's all been in the seed form of the deposit of faith. And so we just start talking like high scholastic theology at people and go like, why don't they get what we're saying? And you're like, you spoke in Latin half the time, or whatever it might be. But then on the flip side, there are people who go, oh, well, because we don't want to do that, when they're initiating people into the mysteries, which that's all mystagogia means, right, is this idea is like, okay, let's get them baptized into the church. And then traditionally, that's when you really start teaching them. We let that fall to the wayside and go like, well, if you like wink at Jesus statues as you walk by, you've got it made. And you go, so there's the already not yet, the both and, in the world, not of the world, fully human, fully divine, flesh and spirit. We're pros at this, Bud. We've been doing this for ages, where we believe in the hylomorphic unity, the integrity of two seemingly opposed binaries that we know actually belong together. We've done this before, and when we're at our best, we do this. We know how to speak in the world, recognizing the sort of contemporary idioms that we have to speak in, but we're always aware that once we get people's attention speaking in those idioms, how to point to the everlasting terms that don't change. And anybody who gets too comfortable either, and that's what it is, Bud. They just want people want it to be easy. Oh, well, I just need to learn, language about the church as it existed at, whatever time period is, 1850, 1950, 1982, and then I never want to have to redo anything with it. Or it's, let's just speak how everyone else is speaking. That would be easiest. We have to do both, but both and is not an escape route. It is a higher calling to take care of the Word who takes care of us. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back right after this. We're back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Bud had to run off. We've talked about in the opening segment that Bud is a man with great responsibility. He has to run off and do provost duties here, so I will close out the show today. I do hope the very wide-ranging things we talked about, that we start to see the connection between all of those. You might have disagreements about political realities like that we were bringing up from Black Lives Matter, the sort of summers over 2020, 2021. Certainly speaking about abortion in any sort of context in 2023 America is bound to ruffle at least some feathers. Even with people who agree with you, there's frustrations abounding about the direction the world is heading, especially the United States in that regard. I do hope homoousion and that Jesus Christ is one in substance with the Father is we have fewer listeners that would have any sort of disagreements about that, and certainly the same thing with transubstantiation. But the idea and the thread connecting all of those is to say we have a responsibility to continually talk about these things. But that is not because those terms are up for sort of a democratic process where we vote on the best way to say things, but it's a reality of who we are as humans, that our language has to be context dependent, but that doesn't mean the truth is relative and it's always changing. We're going to talk about the truth, and how we talk about it will have to change because of the necessities of who we are and our lived life. So it's obviously going to be the case that when we talk about whatever it is worrying us, the sort of technology that shapes who we are is going to make us talk about it different. I know this is something I yarn on about continually, but if you have written words in a book, you might be prone to think through a problem in a sort of linear way, and you go, oh, well, I'm going to think in a way where my thoughts have a table of contents, and then they sort of break down into various chapters, and those chapters have paragraphs. That's one way that we sort of organize the arguments that we're a part of. In the digital world, you might think of arguments more like surfing the web or like making connections or hitting hyperlinks. My point is to say those realities, which were not available to people before, are going to influence how we talk about things now. That doesn't condemn the people of the past, but it certainly means that we are going to have to not update our language just to stay with the times, but to speak to the reality that people are living. The truths of all those things, theological, ethical, and besides, have a kernel of the eternal with them always. And we can be confident knowing that those terms, as it were, are safeguarded in the mind of God, in which nothing changes just for the sake of changing. Our job is to incarnate that eternal reality throughout history for the sake of the world. That's where the church is the sort of living sacrament of the truth of God, and we live that out. That means we have to be attentive, we have to listen, but not so that we can dumb down or water down the faith, but so just as Jesus Christ himself took on flesh so that the truth could be encountered in a life lived, we do something similar with our language. And I hope that that's what you understand from the show today. It's been a great conversation. I'm sad Bud had to run off because I wanted to hear him agree. It was such a wonderful discussion. Wrapping this up real quick, if you need to know what's going on with Iowa Catholic Radio, you can go to iowacatholicradio.com. All the events are listed there. The big one I want to throw out, of course, is that you can give to make this reality. This ministry that we do together a possibility. You can donate at iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, and of course you can call 515-223-1150 or text 515-223-1150 to make a donation. Participating in our events, again, iowacatholicradio.com, and donating are one of the ways in which our local programming and just our existence as a radio station continues on. So prayerfully, I hope you consider doing that for us. This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, our families, our city, state, nation, world, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good. And for Bud Marr, who I'm sure if he was here would give the thumbs up to saying, we love you guys and we appreciate all your prayers, this is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.